Hi, I'm Jodie Rosé-O'Brien, part of the AWI Extension South Australia team. In today's 10-minute talk, we're going to hear from Deb Scammell from Talking Livestock about 2024 hay quality and how to utilise in livestock ration.
Hi, I'm Deb Scammell. I'm a livestock consultant with Talking Livestock based out of the Clare Valley. So today I'm here to talk to you about hay quality in 2024. What an interesting and disappointing season we've had this year. So when we look at hay quality, as you guys are aware, we've had that really late break, which means germination was really late in a lot of our crops. And then due to the low rainfall throughout the growing season, we've also just had really tough growing conditions. So what we've seen is these really short crops that have made our hay test quite interesting. And I was very worried about availability of hay, but you know, the only silver lining with the widespread state frost we've had is that we've suddenly got a lot more bulk hay than what we thought. So a lot of those frosted crops, so we've had wheat, barley, and a lot of canola hay that's been cut down just due to severe frost damage. So I'll cover the quality of those as well. The first thing we'll look at on our feed test for the 24 cereal hay is the fibre content. So in a normal growing season where we have that, you know, quite high sort of bulk in the hay, as the hay crop starts to mature, and the same with your frosted cereals, as the structure in the plant increases, we start to get more fibre in that plant. And that means when we look at a feed test, the NDF values start to go up. And I'll talk a little bit about NDF shortly. But this year, as you guys are aware, we've got these really short cereal crops and the hay crops just haven't grown in height. So when we look at those structural components, we don't have the fibre levels that we'd normally expect in the hay. So when we look at NDF, so if you feed test your hay, you'll get this NDF figure, which is your neutral detergent fibre. That'll basically quantify the digestible fibre component. And the reason we look at NDF for ruminants is it also helps us determine how much of that hay a ruminant can intake in a day. So when we look at the NDF figure, the ranges I've seen so far for NDF for currently tested cereal hay has been about 47 through to sort of 52% NDF. So to put that in comparison, if you look at straw, it's often sort of that 68 to 70% NDF. Our 22 hay wasn't much better than straw, as you'll probably all remember. So the 22 hay was up sort of 65% plus in NDF. You know, probably 23 hay and normal cereal hay we'd expect to be around that mid-50s in NDF. So the figures we're seeing this year at that 47 to 52 is very low in fibre content. And as I said, it's just due to that shortness of plant. It hadn't matured, it hasn't had the rainfall to start to get that real structural fibre as it gets older. So what we're seeing this year when we look at animal intakes is they can basically consume a whole lot more of this hay because it's low fibre, and when you look at it, how it can move and be digested through the rumen, they're digesting it quite quickly and they've got space to keep consuming more. So I'll talk a little bit later about how using rations we can make use of this low NDF hay. So it is problematic when we're looking at lower energy diets, but when we're looking at lambing ewes and later in gestation period, it's going to be a very valuable feed source for us. So we'll move on to digestibility and energy. So as a plant matures also, so when we've got our freshly grown green crops, we're often in that 75 to 80% range of digestibility, and that's the proportion of the feed that the animal can basically utilise. As the growing season goes on, our digestibility starts to decline, and it drops quite quickly after that flowering sort of period. So when we look at hay, the best time to cut hay is sort of just before, right on the point of flowering, before digestibility starts to decline. So as I said, because we've had that late germination and the plants have come up a bit later, we've found most hay this year has been cut at very high digestibility. So with high digestibility, basically that's correlated to the energy the animal can get from the hay. So we're also getting very high energy in most of the hay we've got access to this year. So, you know, the current range I'm seeing in cereal hay is around that 9 to 10.5 megajoules per kilo dry matter. The frosted crops that have been cut were also cut at quite a perfect stage for hay. So in most cases, they were frosted just as the grains were starting to fill on those crops. So we've also found they've been testing quite well. So energy levels have been really good on those too, at sort of that 9 to 10 megs per kilo dry matter sort of on average. So overall, 24 hay, you're going to see high digestibility figures on your feed test and also high energy values for your livestock. In most cases, the non-structural carbohydrates and sugar levels of the hay have increased, and that's just due to the drought conditions. So because we had such a dry growing condition, all those sugars that are normally converted to future growth have stayed in the leaf. So it's given us high quality hay for livestock, but it is very high in carbs and sugars. Just moving on to crude protein. So what we get with crude protein is basically we've got nitrogen available in the soil that helps with the growth of those plants. So again, because we just haven't produced the bulk crops this year, what we've found is we haven't had that usual dilution level of the nitrogen. So in most cases, this has allowed the plant to still contain very high quantities of crude protein. So, when we look at the different hay types, we've got higher protein hays like vetch and lucerne that are probably sitting relatively consistent with where we'd expect them to be, sort of that 18 to 22% crude protein. But on cereal hay, I find in most cases, because we haven't created the bulk, we have seen a slight increase in crude protein. So, your typical oat hay, we're probably seeing that 9% plus in crude protein, where in a really bulky year, I'd expect that to be slightly lower. So as I mentioned, due to the widespread frost, we've ended up cutting some other types of hay that we wouldn't normally cut. So there's been a lot of canola hay cut, with a lot of it likely to come onto the market. So, my general advice around canola hay is be a bit careful, because that real fibrous stalk in the middle of the plant can make, it can be unpalatable. And often we sort of have mouth issues and it getting sort of stuck in the teeth and mouths of especially sheep. But what we're seeing this year, because those plants weren't overly mature when they got frosted, is that stalk actually isn't as substantial as I'd normally expect in hay. So quality-wise, it's actually come up quite well. So, we're probably expecting protein around sort of 14 to 15% on most of the canola hay. Fibre has been down around that 50% NDF as well, and digestibility and energy is quite good. So, probably again over that 9 megs per kilo dry matter. Yeah, so depending on individual feed tests, canola could fill a really good gap for sort of growing stock or coming into joining, just because of that additional protein, and the lower fibre and less stalk makes it quite a suitable hay, I think, this year. So I guess, as I said, what an interesting season, because we've been waiting all year for that decent rain. And I said to a lot of people, I'm sure that late spring rain's going to come when we've got hay on the ground. So, even though we've ended up with reasonable quality hay, there's still a large quantity of hay that was on the ground and has had sort of 40 to 60 mil of rain on the windrows before it was baled. So once again, most of the tests I've seen have come back pretty reasonable for moulds, but something to watch when you're buying wet hay is there's always that risk of the presence of moulds and mycotoxins. So when you do get a feed test on the hay, getting you your feed quality, you can also get a mycotoxin test result, which will tell you whether there's mycotoxins which are going to create sort of a risk for animal performance or health. So worth asking if your hay has had substantial quantities of rain on it. When hay's wet in the windrow as well, we do get a bit of leaching of energy content. So not a lot of the wet hay's just being baled at this point, but I'm expecting that some of that hay is likely to be around a meg lower in energy per kilo dry matter. So again, just critical to get individual feed test results for some of that hay before you purchase it. So when we're looking at feeding stock, as I said, I've given you some of the average feed qualities I'm expecting. So we're expecting really low fibre, which means that animals are likely to intake higher quantities of this hay that's going to be available. We're going to have higher digestibility and higher energy in most cases, and our crude protein I'm expecting to be slightly up. So what we look at for implications is, I'm looking at the barrel of feed budgets for supplementary feeding stock for, up to 6 months. And currently we're sort of coming into that joining period and feeding dry stock, which, they often only have that sort of 10 to 11 meg per day requirement for energy. So the problem we've got with this low fibre, high energy hay is, in a lot of cases, because the fibre's not slowing down intake, we're going to be likely to get 16 to 17 megajoules per day out of the hay if you leave it totally ad lib available for the animal to consume. So, my normal go-to is to use straw and often top up energy with better hay or barley. So, this year it's going to be critical, I think, when we're looking at dry stock and during early gestation to try and access some lower quality, higher fibre hay or straw if possible. So, I'm predicting we're going to struggle to get the straw bulk we need. But if you do have availability of lower quality hay, it's critical for us to use it sort of earlier. And then that low fibre, high energy hay is absolutely going to be perfect as they get later in pregnancy. And in a lot of cases, we're actually going to be able to lamb single bearing ewes on just high quality cereal hay rather than our standard of topping up with sort of energy pellets and barley. If you're unable to find that fibrous, high fibre, sort of lower energy straw or hay, so realistically, I never thought I'd say it, but that 22 hay would fit perfectly if you had dry stock or stock in early gestation. But without the availability of that, realistically, it's going to be, rationing out a little bit that high quality hay, because I think if you give it to them ad lib, it really is, off some of the feed test results, really like rocket fuel. Like they're just going to put on serious condition when they don't overly need it sort of in that early pregnancy or at a dry stage. As always, I've given you sort of average values that I've seen so far for the 2024 season, but I'd encourage you strongly to do individual feed tests or request one when you're going to buy hay. So it's a little bit over $60 depending on the company you go for, and that'll give you the individual dry matter content, the digestibility and energy levels, the NDF or the fibre level, and also that crude protein. And it will also give you the sugars and carbohydrates that I just talked about. So once you've got your feed test and you've got that individual nutritional breakdown for your own fodder, I encourage you, if you need assistance, to get individual help with sort of ration formulation and carrying it through to a feed budget, because unfortunately we've still got a long sort of 6 months ahead of us before the next sort of break. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb, for sharing your experience and professional knowledge on 2024 hay quality and its utilisation. This 10-minute talk was made possible by the support of Australian Wool Innovation, the Department of Primary Industries and Regions, and the South Australian Sheep Industry Fund.